October 23, 1959, Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. Lunchtime. What happened in those next 3 seconds would become the most legendary act of violence in the prison's history. But here's what makes this story absolutely insane. It wasn't the most brutal attack Alcatraz had ever seen, not even close. So why did inmates talk about it for decades? Why did this story spread through every federal prison in America? Stay with me, because the answer will shock you.
Picture this: 260 of America's most dangerous criminals trapped on an island prison in San Francisco Bay. Among them, a 54-year-old former Harlem crime boss named Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, 7 years into a 15-year sentence. But Johnson wasn't just any inmate. This man had controlled millions in illegal gambling, survived decades of gang wars, and built an empire that made Italian mob families nervous. At 54, most men are thinking about retirement. Johnson? He was about to teach a lesson that would echo through prison walls for the next 50 years.
Now here's where it gets interesting. There was another inmate at Alcatraz, Eric Polson, 6'4", 275 pounds of pure muscle, a triple murderer who'd killed 3 black men in Texas and laughed about it in court. He told the judge, and I'm paraphrasing here because his actual words were vile, that he saw it as pest control, not murder. This man arrived at Alcatraz in 1957 after assaulting multiple prisoners at other facilities. He was too dangerous for regular prisons. But Polson was smart about his violence. He didn't just attack people where guards could see. He had a system. He'd take food off black prisoners' trays. He'd bump into them in showers, making it look accidental, but hitting hard enough to hurt. He'd whisper slurs when guards weren't close enough to hear. For 2 years, he got away with it. Why? Because he was careful enough to avoid serious punishment. And let's be honest, some guards quietly approved of how he kept people in their place. October 16, 1959. This is where everything started. Johnson was sitting in the cafeteria, eating lunch with 3 other inmates. Polson walked past, reached down without breaking stride, and took Johnson's dessert, a piece of apple pie. Just took it, sat down at his own table and ate it while staring at Johnson with complete contempt. Everyone at Johnson's table was ready to explode, but Johnson? He just looked at where his dessert had been, glanced at Polson, and went back to eating like nothing happened. No reaction. Nothing. The other inmates thought Johnson was scared. They didn't understand what Johnson was actually doing. He was giving Polson rope, enough rope to hang himself. 3 days later, Monday morning, the communal showers. Johnson was washing up when Polson walked straight toward him, ignoring all the empty shower stations, and shoved Johnson hard enough that he slipped on the wet floor. Polson announced to everyone that this shower was for white men only. Johnson stood up slowly, water dripping off him, looked at Polson for several seconds, then simply moved to a different shower. No words, no anger, nothing. Again, everyone thought Johnson was being weak, a man who'd built a criminal empire in Harlem, just walking away from disrespect. But the smart inmates, the ones who understood prison politics, they knew something was brewing. Johnson was making Polson confident, overconfident, and confidence makes people careless. Wednesday afternoon, the prison yard. Johnson was walking with 2 inmates when Polson blocked their path, told Johnson that white men walk straight, black men walk around. Johnson looked at him for a moment, stepped off the path, and walked around. Polson laughed and shouted after him, making sure everyone heard the humiliation. By Wednesday evening, the entire prison was talking about it. Some thought Johnson had gone soft. Others suspected he was planning something. That night, Johnson told another inmate something crucial. I'm giving him enough rope to hang himself. Right now, if I attack him, I go to solitary. But if I let him keep pushing, eventually he'll cross the line. Then I can respond in a way that's justified. Be patient. This will resolve itself very soon. Thursday afternoon.
This is the moment that sealed Polson's fate. A young inmate named Robert Jackson, 23 years old, 140 pounds, serving time for postal fraud, was sitting on a bench reading a book. Polson walked up, snatched the book from Jackson's hands, and started mocking him. When Jackson politely asked for his book back, Polson hit him across the face with it, knocking him to the ground. Then Polson threw the book into a puddle of dirty water and stood over Jackson, telling him that black people weren't smart enough to read. Guards broke it up. Polson got a verbal warning and lost 1 day of recreation privileges. That's it. Jackson went to the infirmary with a split lip and a black eye. That evening, Johnson gathered several inmates and said something that made everyone understand what was coming. Tomorrow at lunch, Polson is going to learn a lesson he'll remember for the rest of his life. Friday, October 23rd, 12:15 p.m. The cafeteria at Alcatraz seated 250 inmates at long tables, guards stationed at strategic positions. Meals were regimented, silent, controlled. Violence during meals was rare because guards had clear sight lines, and everyone knew starting a fight meant immediate solitary confinement. Johnson received his food tray and sat at his assigned table, eating quietly. 2 minutes later, Polson entered, got his tray, and instead of going to his own table, walked directly to Johnson's table and sat down across from him, uninvited, deliberate. He started loudly calling Johnson slurs, trying to provoke a reaction. Johnson kept eating without looking up. This made Polson angrier. Then Polson turned his attention across the cafeteria to Robert Jackson, the young man he'd beaten the day before. Jackson's face still showed the bruising. Polson shouted across the room, asking if Jackson had learned his lesson, threatening to come over and teach him another one. Jackson looked down at his food, terrified. Other inmates started to stand up to defend him, but guards shouted for everyone to stay seated. And then Bumpy Johnson stood up. What happened next lasted 3 to 4 seconds. Johnson stood from his seat, and as he rose, his right hand moved to his waist. In one smooth motion, so fast most witnesses didn't clearly see it, Johnson pulled out a blade, 4 inches long, sharpened metal, a shank that he somehow hidden on his body and smuggled into the cafeteria. Johnson walked around the table toward Polson, 8 feet, 2 seconds. Polson saw him coming and started to stand, hands moving to defend himself, but Johnson was faster. His right arm moved in a horizontal slash across Polson's face, left cheekbone to right jaw. 1 second. The blade opened a 7-inch gash that immediately poured blood.
Polson screamed, a sound of pure shock and pain. His hands went to his face, trying to stop the blood flowing down his neck. But Johnson wasn't finished. Before guards could react, before Polson could defend himself, before anyone could intervene, Johnson's arm moved again, this time an upward diagonal slash, crossing the first wound at an angle. The blade caught Polson's right eye, slicing through the eyelid and into the eye itself. Polson collapsed backward, falling over the bench, landing on the cafeteria floor in a spreading pool of his own blood, screaming continuously, hands covering his destroyed eye, blood streaming through his fingers. The cafeteria erupted. Guards rushed in, blowing whistles, shouting orders. Inmates scattered. Within 15 seconds, 5 guards surrounded Johnson with weapons drawn. Johnson dropped the blade, held up his hands, and allowed himself to be handcuffed without resistance. But before they dragged him away, before they could get Polson medical attention, Johnson said one sentence that every witness heard clearly. One sentence that would be repeated in prisons across America for the next 50 years. Touch that young brother again, and next time you won't visit a doctor, you'll visit God. Eric Polson survived, but barely. The first slash required 127 stitches and left a permanent scar from his left cheekbone to his right jaw. The second slash destroyed his right eye completely. Emergency surgery removed what remained of the eyeball. Polson was blind on his right side for the rest of his life. Here's what's crazy. Johnson was placed in solitary confinement, but the investigation lasted 2 weeks and included dozens of witness interviews. What they discovered was exactly what Johnson had calculated. Multiple witnesses testified that Polson had been harassing black prisoners for weeks, that he'd physically assaulted Jackson the day before, that on the day of the attack, Polson had sat at Johnson's table uninvited, used slurs repeatedly, and threatened Jackson. Johnson's statement was simple. I defended myself and another inmate from a racist prisoner who'd been threatening us for a week. I used the minimum force necessary to ensure he would stop. I don't regret defending Robert Jackson. Violence was necessary because guards weren't protecting us. After 2 weeks, prison administration made a surprising decision. Johnson would serve 30 days in solitary for possession of a weapon and assault, but he wouldn't get additional years added to his sentence. Why? Because investigators concluded Johnson had been provoked by sustained harassment, and the attack, while excessive, was understandable given the circumstances. The prison administration couldn't admit it publicly, but they knew Polson had been terrorizing inmates for years, and guards had done nothing. So punishing Johnson too severely would mean admitting their failure. They gave him 30 days, transferred Polson to another facility when he recovered, and quietly closed the case. But the story was just beginning. What happened in that cafeteria became legendary, not just at Alcatraz, but in federal prisons across America. The legend emphasized several things: Johnson's strategic patience, enduring a week of harassment while waiting for the justified moment; the speed and precision, 2 slashes in 3 seconds before guards could react; the mystery of the weapon, nobody knew where he'd hidden it; and that threat, next time you'll visit God. When Johnson was released from solitary after 30 days, everything had changed. White racist prisoners who'd felt comfortable using slurs now kept quiet around Johnson. Young black inmates treated him with reverence. Even guards showed more respect. Nobody messed with Bumpy Johnson after that. Nobody took his food, nobody pushed him, nobody used slurs around him. Robert Jackson, the 23-year-old Polson had been threatening, was released in 1962. He told his family that Johnson saved his life that day, that Johnson taught him about courage and standing up to bullies. When Jackson died in 1997, his family found a newspaper clipping about Johnson's death in his wallet with a handwritten note: "He saved me when no one else would." Eric Polson was transferred to Leavenworth in December 1959. He was a changed man, physically disfigured, psychologically broken. He was released in 1971, worked manual labor jobs in Texas, and died in 1989. People who knew him said he rarely talked about prison, but when he did, he'd touch the scar on his face and say, "I learned the hard way that being big doesn't make you tough, and being tough doesn't make you smart. I thought I was the most dangerous man at Alcatraz. Turns out I wasn't even close." Bumpy Johnson was released from Alcatraz in November 1963 after serving 10 years. He returned to Harlem, reclaimed his empire, and lived until July 1968, when he died of a heart attack at 62. But that story, those 3 seconds in the cafeteria, outlived him by decades. The phrase, "next time you'll visit God," became one of the most quoted lines in prison culture. The story became a cautionary tale about what happens when bullies pick the wrong target, when people assume size makes them untouchable, when they forget that the quietest, oldest inmate might be the most dangerous person in the facility. That was October 23, 1959, the day a 54-year-old man showed a 275-pound triple murderer that age doesn't diminish danger when intelligence guides the violence. The day Bumpy Johnson proved that patience, strategy, and precision are more valuable than size and strength. The 3 seconds that changed Alcatraz forever.